So now that we've shared our experience and examples of our lives, um, we wanted to talk about like, is there actually historical or biblical basis for the patriarchy? And I feel like that's a lot of what Beth Allison Barr talks about in her book, but we're probably just going to kind of talk about our ideas and thoughts. So if you want more information, go read her book.
Yeah, I think the part in one of many parts in the book that just blew my mind was when she was talking about the culture of, I guess, Rome. It was Rome, right? All of a sudden blinking at the time. And as Christians, people always say that we're supposed to model ourselves after Jesus and not after the world. But the part that blew my mind is that at the time, the model of patriarchy that we have now is actually the model of the Roman world at that time. So just the fact that we think that we're living the church thinks that they're living all counter culturally and living, set apart. But in reality, that it isn't revolutionary. It's what the Romans, what people call the pagans, were doing all the way back then. So we're not living counterculturally. We're living what the unsaved people were living 2,000 years ago.
And I think kind of going back to what you were talking about earlier, Tennille, about the examples that we have from the Bible of women being raised up and given respect and given dignity. And you have Mary Magdalene and the other women that were at the tomb first, that were given the information that Jesus has risen from the dead, and they're the first ones that know. And I think even back to some other teachings and stuff that I don't think was in this book, but I think was maybe in some of our classes actually at school, Tennille, was like legally those witnesses, the first witnesses who were women, would not have been legally allowed to be witnesses to that fact. And yet they were the ones that Jesus gave that responsibility to take back to his male followers. And I think that was something that probably in the beginnings of me thinking through all of this, or even just confirming to me that women have a place, and Jesus gave women a place, and the early church gave women a place of, they're the ones given the most important information from the get-go.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the Bible verse, there is no mediator between man and God. And yet within patriarchy, it tries to set up, in essence, the husband or the pastor or whatever man as being some sort of intermediary between women and God. And you see that in extreme examples where, actually not even that extreme. It's even mainstream people say things like that it's the husband's responsibility to wash his wife in the word or to lead her to Jesus. And it's no, there is no mediator. Jesus did it all. We either believe that Jesus did it all or we don't. I don't know.
Also, just that terminology, wash wife in the word, gross. Not
it is a little
that. Not into that.
Not into that.
Yeah.
I mean, the three of us are all completely aware of the arguments for patriarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's what made especially in the Making of Biblical Womanhood, the point on the chapter on Paul, that one was really eye-opening to me because she specifically addressed some of the key verses that are thrown in our faces so often of women are to submit to their husbands and all of this kind of thing, and just the different interpretation that she gave to that was just freeing. And then it lends itself to other topics as well throughout the whole Bible, as far as how else are we almost willfully and ignorantly misinterpreting the Bible? And how much freedom could we find in faith if we had a different interpretation?
I think, yeah, that chapter on where she talks about the different, just a completely different take, I guess, on Paul's writings, and just kind of her looking at it from a different perspective, was really freeing, because I feel like there's so many times where those words are used against women, and it's discouraging, and it's deflating. And like you said, it was really freeing reading that. And even I think one of the things that there was like one specific passage that she talked about, and I don't remember which one it was, so go read the book. But I was reading through it and I was like, good grief, the theological gymnastics that I have always heard on this verse. And she explained it, and I was like, oh wow, that's a lot plainer of a reading than I've ever heard. Like the things that you have to do to jump through these hoops. And then she like completely changed, like she didn't change what Paul was saying, but she interpreted it in a different way than I have ever heard it. And it was like, oh, oh wow, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's almost like, for me, it was just like all the pieces started lining up. It was like, yeah. And I think the other cool thing from her book is, because like, you take a class on church history, or the early church, it's always about men, and there are some great, we should be learning about the men in church history. But in the book, she highlighted, because the author is a medieval historian, she highlighted a lot of women from the first chunk of church history that I didn't even know existed. And some of them were more like, what's the word? Like myths, like probably didn't actually happen, but some of them like legitimately did. Like there have always been, and I can't remember if she quoted this verse in conjunction, but it at least makes me think of the verse. There is a cloud of witnesses that is also made up of women. It's not just a male cloud of witnesses.
Yeah, I was going to add to a similar point. I'm glad that you brought up that the author Beth Allison Barr is a historian, specifically a medieval historian, I think. And also I was thinking like, okay, did you both also want to go out and read the book of Marjorie Kemp? Because I did after reading her book. But I think this is also another completely side tangent topic, really, but the importance of context comes up again. And I just think it's interesting because growing up, it was kind of something that was understood that context, like cultural context, didn't matter in reading the Bible, in a way, if that makes sense. So like, it should be, the Bible is to be literally translated in today's context as well as in Roman context or ancient Israel. And I think it is becoming a lot more prevalent now to consider cultural and historical context when interpreting, what the Bible says, which is great. And so I appreciate that, she does that as well, like in the Paul chapter where she's talking about, well, this is actually what he was talking about because of this context. And so yeah, I appreciate that she brings that up. And so then that also connects back to the point of, is there a historical and biblical basis for patriarchy? And that's, needing to consider the cultural and historical context.
I think the section that also really stood out, which was in her chapter about Paul and his theology and all of the women verses in his books and everything, but she talks about her quote, "It was Paul's women in Romans 16 who finally changed my mind." And she lists 7 women: Phoebe, Priscilla, Mary, Junia, Tryphena, and Tryphosa. Persis, Rufus's mother, Julia, and Nereus's sister. She says 10 women recognized by Paul, 7 of them are recognized by their ministry. Phoebe, Priscilla, Mary, Junia, Tryphena, Tryphosa, and Persis. And I think that is just encouraging when Paul is used against women, honestly, so often, that he trusted and respected women for their ministry and for what they did for the early church, and for the spread of the gospel. Like, they were important, not just important, but influential and pivotal in the church. And I think that was the thing too, even beyond those people that we see in the books of the Bible, in the letters of the Bible, but her information and her specialty being that medieval history of looking for the women of medieval history in the church who had an impact, who said, no, we have a place because Jesus and the Bible give us a place. We are part of all people who get to be delivering good news and love of God to people. So I think one of the things that from the book, and then just from other things, that we all realized was how much of a trickle down effect there is from the patriarchy that affect other beliefs, theological positions, practical living even. So what are some of the spider webs that stem from biblical patriarchy?
Yeah, we could do a whole other drink and rant just on those things.
Yeah.
I think one of the big things that she talked about in her book was when she was talking about Bible translations. And specifically, she used the example of when the ESV translation was created. And it was interesting because I remember that. I remember it being a big hubbub in the church community, and people talking about why other translations were, trying to erode or flatten the, beauty of the different genders. And the ESV was just by far the best translation. And, everybody needs to get anyways, everybody loved the ESV. And, reading in this book and some other, books that I've been reading, how the ESV came into being, in that it was a distinct decision to create the ESV translation in order to counteract the perceived changing of gender roles, and then the specific choices that the translators used in the words that they chose to translate and convey their preconceived beliefs of patriarchy. And that just blew my mind.
Yeah, that was definitely a very fascinating discussion to me too, because that was also something that I would say directly affected what version of the Bible I read, and things that our family chose to do. Just like the bias that comes into translation, and the choices that and the biases that people on the translation committees make, and how that affects people, how it affects people and their lives. And I think so. I guess specifically, like the ESV was to go up against a different translation. I think it was the new NIV, TNIV.
I don't remember.
I think that's what it was. And their push for gender neutral, gender inclusive language that the Bible has. And just the difference that makes in reading it, and especially reading it being the specific gender that we are. So I think that is, because I think that she even had like examples of different verses from different translations, and just the difference that makes in reading it was incredible. And it was like, oh, wow.
I think what all of that makes me think of, which is not specifically related to spider webs and trickle down, but in school, Jeanette, somebody had mentioned the sanctity of the open hand or the open grasp in faith, as far as like holding things, supporting them, like and defending them, but not so tightly that you can't let it go if you're wrong. It's a little bit scary to think about, but thinking about that even in terms of just literally the Bible that we have, how do we even know what to believe if literally, but I mean, we're kind of screwed reading it in English anyway, so regardless. But I think so that's where, I'm thinking of the sanctity of the open hand or the open grasp, because, figuring out how to build a faith on this text, but loosely, I guess, to say like, okay, this, I'm gonna interpret this way, but I have to understand, like, I'm not even close to reading it in the way it was intended, so by the original author. So I've got to kind of just be okay with that. And that's really hard, I think, for conservative Christians to do.
Definitely.
To be okay with uncertainty.
And I think that whole concept of the open hand applies to like the specific conversation of patriarchy too, because it is scary, like to come across a new belief, but so often in my experience, it's like that, people say, only Jesus saves you, but if you're in support of ordaining women, or Beth Moore, or like controversial people, then your faith is kind of seen as suspect. So it's like, I think it's healthy to have that perspective that, I could be wrong. And I do want to, give understanding, because I'm assuming that, a good chunk of people who believe in biblical patriarchy are honestly trying to do, honor God and do justice to the text. And I think it's just hard when things that we have always seen, I mean, I went through this, that we have always seen as, well, this is the way it is, to see it from a new perspective. It is a big ask, but I love that concept of holding things with an open hand.
And I think she even talked about that kind of in a different words, but same thing of, I think it was a professor or something that she had, but they asked the question, what if I'm wrong? And that idea that just makes you listen to other people. What if I'm wrong? Then how do I listen to other people, and how do I hear a different perspective and say, maybe that's not something that I quite agree with, or maybe it's something that I'm going to chew on and I'm going to change my mind on, and that's okay.
Yeah.
I think that's a great question to ask yourself too, as far as if we were to find ourselves in positions of teaching or preaching, you know, obviously I'm not saying that anybody who is teaching or preaching is taking that responsibility lightly, but in thinking about it, you know, like, what are the ramifications of this teaching if I am wrong? And I think that's where, you know, a lot of people maybe don't consider what they're teaching, you know, what the ramifications of teaching patriarchy, you know, and they may not realize that that's what they're teaching in some ways, but like considering the ramifications of what you teach. Obviously, you can't think of everything, but you know, in youth groups talking about dating, you know, or courting, depending on your circumstances, you know, thinking about what are the ramifications if I'm wrong about the way I'm presenting this. So
Yeah. I think maybe kind of some of the things that like you guys were talking about with the, I don't know, just like getting into translations and the different biases and like how that changes what we read as a clear and plain reading of the Bible. But I think so much of what we grew up with in our Christian culture was this very much like has to be this way because of the inerrancy of scripture. And I think that that is something that even in the book that it's like, what does that mean and how are we getting that and what are we basing it on? And I think that was something challenging too, even with what we were talking about earlier with like the myths and the legends of some of these medieval women of, okay, these are stories that might not be quite accurate. And like the accuracy of the Bible or your perspective of the accuracy of the Bible can really change how you take so many different things. And it brings, I feel like, a lot of fear to our faith. It brings this idea that if the Bible is struck down in any way, or you question it in any way, or even if some of the stories are not maybe completely historically accurate to what really truthfully happened, then where does that leave you? And how do we take the Bible as something of an authority, but maybe it doesn't have like as much of like a rigid grip on our lives and on our theology? And I think that's something that's really hard for us to deal with as having grown up in conservative Christianity. And then just even having conversations with people that either are still in conservative Christianity or also grew up in that, like, how do we take this and how do we use the Bible and take its truth in a way that is freeing and life-giving as it should be, instead of bounding us in these boxes that we have to follow and that God has to be in and that the church has to be in and that you as a man have to be in and you as a woman have to be in. It's just all boxes and it's so logical, and where's the heart in that? Where is God's heart in that? That's my rant.
Mic drop.
Mic drop.
That I was just thinking that kind of encapsulates what both of you were saying in the last few minutes, is if we're able to truly and honestly listen to other people and have genuine conversations and hold things with open hands, I think that we'll see and not be bound by that fear. We'll see a lot less of these issues that keep coming up in the news about power and control of pastors overstepping, specifically in relation to this conversation, with women.
Another thing that we could get into very much, but that will have to be for another thing, is purity culture. And if you know what that is,
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Yep. And if you don't, good for you. But one of the things that I felt like was just mind-blowing and like, I don't know, it just hurt, honestly, was the harm that came, and she specifically has it in here about how it came about from the Reformation, but the identity and the independence that it takes away from women, and it's kind of a little bit of a long quote, but I'm gonna read it. French activist Paule Nink defended women, claiming that by denying women the right to work, you degrade her, you put her under man's yoke, and you deliver her over to man's good pleasure. By ceasing to make her a worker, you deprive her of her liberties and thereby of her responsibilities, so that she no longer will be a free and intelligent creature, but will merely be a reflection, a small part of her husband. And apparently that is part that she talks about in one of her lectures. So she says, I always pause at this point in my lecture. Mink argued that by forcing women to remain in the home, by denying women the right to work if they so desired, women would not only lose their freedoms, but their identities. And that quote just hit me. And I don't remember if I started crying, but I felt like crying, because I think that is one of the major things that I have seen of the damage of women in this system, because like, you're taking people's identity away from them by making them be just a part of their husband, just a sliver of their husband, of the men in their lives. They're not people anymore. And to do that to half of the population of the world and a majority of the population in churches, because women are typically the majority of population in churches, is cruel and wrong. And I think that that is something that is just so detrimental in this system. So yeah, that's my rant for today. So that's obviously a lot, and there's a lot that can be said further. And so regardless of where you come from, if you have been in the church where you have grown up in that system, I apologize. I'm sorry that that has been where you've grown up. I hope that we can all help each other to live freer and lift each other up instead of putting each other down, because that's how it should be.
Thanks for joining us, Tennille. This is awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Oh no. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.